The following presentation is the formative assessment submission for Group 18 in the Global and Regional Security Studies module. In order to assess the impact of the EU migration crisis on regional and global security, we have chosen the GRSS concept of globalization as our perspective of analysis. Now, before we dive into the regional and global security impacts of the EU migration crisis, we must first define and expand upon both the concept of globalization and the recent EU migration phenomenon itself. While a precise and standardized definition of globalization remains elusive in the current literature on the subject, we will be drawing on Jan Art Scholte's definition in Globalization, A Critical Introduction. Scholte begins by making the distinction that globalization is not the same as the often Eurocentric concepts of internationalization, liberalization, universalization, or westernization. Mentioning that the term globalization was largely absent from political discourse until the 1980s, Scholte argues that globalization is the spread of transplanetary and supra-territorial connections between people. It involves the reduction of barriers to trans-world social contacts. These social contacts include communication, travel, production, markets, money, finance, organizations, military, ecology, health, and law. Above all, Scholte states that globalization refers to a shift in the nature of social space. The EU migration crisis began in 2015 and was catalyzed by war and turmoil across the Middle East and Africa, most notably in Syria. In 2015 and 2016 alone, over 1 million migrants arrived in the EU, marking the crisis as the biggest influx of migrants in Europe since the Second World War. The crisis was largely exacerbated by German Chancellor Angela Merkel's unilateral decision to implement a German open-door migration policy in September of 2015. As a result, Germany has accepted the highest number of asylum applications in Europe, and they are followed by France, Italy, Austria, and Sweden.
Considering the perspective of globalization, how has migration impacted regional security concerns? Globalization has lowered resource constraints on mobility, has strengthened migrant networks, and has increased access to global information. Migrant networks are information networks between migrants and their friends and relatives at home. Such networks facilitate further migration. Reasons for migration. Migration has always happened throughout history, whether because of war, famine, natural disaster, persecution, economic opportunity, or trade. What globalization has done is to increase the speed at which such changes happen. The borderless nature of the consequences felt from globalization has in fact ironically heightened people's sensitivity to and insistence on borders. Globalization in social, economic, and political terms leads to the increasing movement of people. Therefore, migration can be considered a byproduct of globalization. The difference in wealth between rich industrialized states and poor agrarian states acts as a catalyst for migration. The EU migration crisis is a direct result of political instability, the developments leading to failed states such as Syria or Libya, and the shattered promise of the Arab Spring. 3 areas of security concerns have been identified as a result of migration. First, political and legal security. Second, cultural and identity security. And third, personal and economic security. Political and legal security. Migration has become a priority for state security. Entry of migrants is often deemed illegal and serves to make the individuals a more noticeable threat. There is widespread fear in the West over people coming from parts of the world where there is violence. As a result, certain immigrants are seen as potential terrorists. Migration is a problem of human trafficking, alongside with the illegal trade of weapons and drugs. The EU is working with key countries of origin and transit in Africa, helping to tackle smuggling and trafficking in human beings. Criminal networks worth billions of dollars every year are flourishing in North Africa and Southern Europe. In a large part of the EU, called the Schengen area, people are able to move freely without internal border controls. But the flow of migrants has caused some EU countries to reintroduce temporary checks at their borders with other Schengen states. Cultural and identity security. Extreme right parties have gained support in advanced market economies as a consequence of migration. Such parties call for the protection of national identity, seen as a vision of the middle-class family living in a semi-rural environment. The unfamiliarity with immigrants' culture has given rise to unease, uncertainty, fear, and rejection. Migration is associated with the dark side of globalization, such as disease, drugs, death, and destruction. Therefore, the flow of migrants across geographic, political, and cultural space can be seen as a natural consequence of globalization and as a perceived threat to order, security, and identity. Personal and economic security. The relationship of immigrants with the welfare state is a contested one. Immigrants are often seen as a threat to the survival of the welfare state. Low-paid immigrant workers are accused of stealing jobs in the developed world and forcing the native population to also accept lower wages. Migration is shaping contemporary politics. Whether migrants are welcome or not often depends on one's perspective and the reason for migration. Neo-racism is a reaction to the economical insecurities created by globalization, with its increased social and geographical levels of inequality. Considering the perspective of globalization, which actors have been responsible in managing the impacts of migration on security at a regional level? The European Union mainly promotes migration between nationals of member states, whereas it has various measures in place to prevent migration of mainly unskilled people from Northern Africa and the Middle East. The rise in migration in 2015 has led to mistrust towards migrants across parts of society in different European states. The media and certain political parties accuse migrants of profiting from welfare states, stealing jobs from locals, and contributing to crime. In certain countries, right parties manage to increase their share in popular vote as a result of the discussion surrounding migration. The European Union has a legal and moral obligation to accommodate people in need of international protection. However, many people leave their countries in an attempt to improve their lives. Such economic migrants do not have a legitimate claim to protection. The EU has put different measures in place in an attempt to reduce migration flows, such as increased border protection, the EU-Turkey Statement of March 2016, or tackling criminal networks. The nature of transnational migration demands international cooperation and shared responsibility. However, most European states have been unwilling to commit fully to the principle of international cooperation in the area of migration. The problems are deeply interconnected and can't be solved with the current firefighting approach. The future of Europe has become linked by sea to the future of the Middle East and North Africa. Much more, the security and stability of the Mediterranean region is not just a European problem.
In this section, we will continue to use the perspective of globalization to examine the EU migration crisis and see how it might have impacted global security concerns. The map on the slide shows clearly that the European migrant crisis was defined to a certain extent by geography. Migrants mostly came from a handful of origin countries, the top 5 being Syria, Kosovo, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Albania. As the names and as the countries suggest, most of the citizens of these countries have faced years of poverty, years of economic hardship, and instances in which many of them would have been fearful for their lives and for their future. Many of these countries are also war torn. So we can infer very easily that the migrants fled for their lives, not primarily to look for better economic opportunities. Most of these migrants were also forced to try to enter Europe by sea and therefore sailed across the Mediterranean, leading to a lot of drownings at sea when the smugglers, whom most of them paid, to try to bring them into Europe. Many of these boats capsized or safety was not observed, and many of the migrants themselves could not swim. By nature, I think this confines the immediate reach and impact of the EU migration crisis to a regional one. But perhaps taking a step back, I think it's worthwhile for us to spend some time to think about why this particular crisis was of such a magnitude, and why did it become a crisis when migration has always happened throughout history. The fact is that the origin countries that these migrants come from are not important in the global economy. They are not part of what we've seen as the massive wave of movement that is globalization. If you take a look at this particular diagram, the purple parts refer to some of the economies within the Africa region where many of these migrants come from. They play a very small part in the global economy, and to that extent, what happens to the migrants there, the economic issues and social issues and political concerns that happen there are not the concerns of most of the rest of the globe. And I think this in particular is very stark when we think about Syria and the civil war that has been happening there for many years. It has been brought to the attention of the global community, but the global community has not done anything concrete to help. For some, like Afghanistan and Iraq, much of the social, economic, political turmoil there could be said to have been caused by some of the hegemons shown in this chart itself, such as the United States and such as the coalition it represented when it invaded Afghanistan and Iraq in the war on terror. So I think from this and from the background, it is understandable as to why the migrants chose to flee and chose to look for a better life. But what can explain the kind of reception they got, and why were the European Union countries so harsh in their treatment of these migrants? Much of the background goes back to the global financial crisis, and in this slide, what you see on the chart here is an index of real per capita GDP growth for many of the countries that were impacted by the GFC that happened in 2007 and 2008. As you can tell, from a starting point of 100, many of the EU economies never did recover. The EU, represented here by the black line, looks pretty good only because of the growth of Germany. And so when you think about that and think about the fact that many of these migrants who crossed the Mediterranean ended up in Italy and Greece, that meant that their host countries or the recipient countries did not want an influx of migrants that they needed to feed and to take care of. And this actually resulted in a groundswell of protests and of anger and of rejection of these migrants. In fact, looking back in history, the EU had actually chosen to save these migrants who were trying to cross the Mediterranean. In 2014 alone, 100,000 of these migrants were saved from drowning in the ocean. However, given the huge influx in numbers, the EU chose to move to an attitude and a position where they merely patrolled the Mediterranean in a bid to discourage and to intercept migrant boats, as a result causing thousands to drown. And this signaled a shift in the policy of many of the EU countries to take a very hard stance against migrants. What this shift clearly means is that we have seen a movement away from the ideas and ideals of globalization and regionalism that was what formed the EU in the first place. Instead, more and more member countries are becoming more inward-looking and focused instead on the negative impact of migrants. Nations have sought to re-establish and support the myth of their national identity and homogeneity in order to contrast with the alien other, which is positioned as posing a threat to their culture, livelihood, resources, safety, and to their society as a whole. Who then can make a difference in the EU migrant crisis? We have seen a rise in racism, a rise in the popularity of the far right, and a rise in the desire of countries to become more insular and to be more protectionistic in their foreign policy. So it really seems that a global coordinated response to confront the rise of the far right is impossible, particularly because these sentiments are not confined to the EU. We have seen them grow globally, and a key example is the rhetoric that we see from the Trump administration in the USA. So, given the difficulty we've already observed in the EU in trying to agree on a common approach to deal with the migrant crisis, as each individual country tries to look after its own interests, is it possible to come up with a coordinated response to the rise of the far right? While the far right is not currently a global security concern, the fact is that the EU migrant crisis and the kind of ripple effects it will have on the societies which have accepted these asylum seekers, that could cause global security concerns to emerge in the years to come. And that really just relates to the point that there will be increasing difficulty for these migrants to assimilate and integrate into their host countries, especially if locals do not accept them. Should there be disenfranchisement and marginalization, it is likely that the migrants will find it difficult to have a decent livelihood or to have a better life. And what we will then see is social strife, a lot of social conflict, and then what that creates is a good breeding ground for extremist views and for terrorist organizations to find easy targets to recruit, and the potential rise of terrorism globally. So, to conclude, I would say that globalization is useful as a concept for us to try to understand the environment in which the EU migrant crisis has happened. What it is less useful for is in providing any kind of insight into how an EU migrant crisis sort of problem could be tackled or could be solved from a global perspective, simply because globalization is an opt-in model. If nations feel that the benefits are outweighed by the price and risks of being a part of the global system, they can take unilateral action or choose not to be a part of the system anymore.
The fourth question that we tackle in this presentation is whether separating the regional and global levels can help us in understanding the migration concerns and positive consequences. Despite differing conclusions, the nature of the arguments surrounding the debate on immigration have essentially been the same from both mainstream left and right political parties in Europe. The basic form of this argument is that immigration is good insofar as it adds to the welfare or well-being of the local economy, society, culture, etc. Now, the most clear example of this comes from right-wing anti-immigration parties that would argue that immigration lowers the wages of a certain economy and undermines the values or cultural fabric of a particular home country. But even if we take a look at left-wing politicians such as Jeremy Corbyn, he says that immigration has helped our economic growth and has boosted the NHS, the social services, and education in the UK, clearly tying the benefits of immigrations to sort of an economic objective. Despite the potential economic benefits of migration, it will never be the case that a particular individual EU country in this case would be able to bear the cost of all the migrants that will want to flee endangered and developing areas south of the Mediterranean. And given this fact, local politicians in whichever EU country it may be will have to accept the inescapable truth that protecting and improving the welfare of a nation state is their primary goal. And Hence, that means improving the welfare of the citizens who vote for them. Therefore, at a regional level, politicians will never be able to place the well-being of migrants above the well-being of citizens. The problem with applying a regional perspective to migration is that it makes it impossible to address a fundamental problem with migration. Briefly, the main issue with migration is that it occurs because war-torn or economically developing countries lose out on well-abled young adults who look for better opportunities in Europe and who, when arriving, lack the knowledge, language, and skills to perfectly integrate immediately. As a result, an important chunk of the home population rejects these migrants and looks to limit legal migration, enhancing the problem. Eventually, chauvinistic, racist, and nationalist tendencies begin to grow, and the vicious cycle continues. Meanwhile, the fundamental problem remains unsolved. Millions of people are forced to risk their lives to pursue a better future in a faraway land that doesn't see them as anything more than potentially an economic benefit. As we mentioned previously, the problem of migration can't be solved by a single country, as no single country can bear the whole burden of migration. By applying a global perspective on migration, however, we can grasp and fully understand that the problem of migration must be solved through international cooperation. Furthermore, it should be solved from a framework that is based on moral grounds, not economic ones. Clearly, helping out poorer regions tends to not be in the economic interests of powerful, rich Western countries. It is likely the case that European countries must find partners throughout the world to come to an agreement to solve the underlying issues that have made possible the misery, poverty, and devastation that causes migration crises. Hence, as we've seen, by taking a global perspective, we can appreciate facts that don't become apparent from a regional perspective. Hence, separating the regional from the global levels of understanding helps us better understand the causes and the potential solutions of the issue of migration.
The EU migration crisis brought to the fore the current debate surrounding the future of nation-states in the international system. Whereas international politics in the latter half of the 20th century were largely shaped by the Cold War struggle between capitalism and communism, the 21st century will largely be shaped by the question of whether states will take a globalist or nationalist approach to future international relations. Globalization was already seen as a threat to the standard of living by right-wing parties in Europe before the crisis, and the handling of migration by EU states lended a perceived legitimacy to these claims. As a result, the EU migration crisis changed the regional political landscape by instigating the rise of right-wing parties, the rise of Eurosceptic European political leaders, particularly in Eastern Europe, and also played an arguably definitive role in the Brexit referendum. As has been demonstrated in this presentation, migration remains unequivocally central to GRSS factors in the contemporary world of security. In the case of the EU migration crisis, we see migration having a marked effect on both the political landscape and political elections throughout the European Union. As support for nationalist policies and skepticism over globalization increases, many of the positive benefits of globalization are being lost, while its overall progress is also being held back. As arguably a product of the migrant crisis, processes like Brexit threaten the unity of the European Union, which in turn compromises the regional security of Europe. As more European states turn inwards towards isolationism and protectionism, The level of global security is similarly compromised, as policies that favor the well-being of the state over the well-being of the international inevitably increases the likelihood of future interstate conflict. One of the major debates in global and regional security studies is to what extent has the state as an actor been weakened by the processes of globalization and regionalization, and in turn superseded by other actors on a subnational, regional, and global level. So taking the EU as an example, globalization and regionalization resulted in the implementation of regional over state borders, which directly decreased the amount of state sovereignty within the EU region. This then created a situation in which the unilateral decision of one EU state could affect the security of all, catalyzing a retreat in many European states towards state-centric and nationalist modes of governance over globalist visions of international cooperation and integration.